Pleased to welcome now to my wonderful Tuesday night panel former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson, the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, although I think he's now a Senior Fellow, he'll correct me, Nick Cater. Both of you, Nick and John, welcome. Glad to have your company on Anzac Day. I said at the top of the show, John Anderson, I think it's the most solemn day on our national calendar. I can't say it's my most favourite day. I don't think it lends itself to being favourite, but I think it's the day that most makes me proud to be Australian. It reminds me of everything that, all the blood that's been shed in the name of our freedom. Lots of people around the country turning out dawn services, a good bump in the numbers, but you've got to wonder whether longer term Anzac Day is going to survive the push by the woke. What do you think?
Yeah, I've been at Manila, and the turnout in Manila, a mid-sized town north of Tamworth, today it has been terrific and really encouraging. A lot of young people. Like you, I don't necessarily enjoy the day. My father was almost killed in the North African campaign against Rommel, and he did not enjoy Anzac Day. He used to say he didn't want to be reminded. But it is a really important day for the rest of us who are the beneficiaries of the sacrifices they made. Now, the story I told today, one of the stories I told, was that from the sheep station that my father and his two brothers enlisted, there were four white men and 3 Indigenous brothers. My father only just came home, but all of the non-Indigenous came home. 2 of the Aboriginal brothers did not come home, yet they had been prepared and their family were prepared to make that sacrifice because they believed in this country. They did. I know the family still. It was an extraordinary thing. And disgracefully, and I made this point today, it's a blot on our character a little bit. We've got to be honest about this. Their family was only given a relatively modest amount, not as much as a legacy benefit as my family would have got if my father or one of his brothers had been killed. But they still went. The other point I'd make is, though, patriotism is dying. We know in America, and we tend to follow the same suit, that baby boomers, 75% of baby boomers will say, I am proud to be American. Only 16% of Generation Zers, 18 to 25-year-olds, will. We have poisoned our young against our culture, and Anzac Day is a powerful reminder that's not wise.
Nick, it was interesting, the former Governor-General, former Chief of the Defence Force made comments today when he was deploying men to Somalia 30 years ago. What concerned them most was not whether they'd get hurt, but whether they could live up to the example of their forefathers. Now, I said it earlier too, we are constantly denigrating men in this country. We denigrate our country and our values, the whole box and dice. But if it wasn't for these men, this toxic masculinity in the past, well, we wouldn't be where we are today. And we remember it today on Anzac Day, and then we sort of conveniently want to forget about it for the rest of the year, don't we?
Yeah, look, it is that tremendous example, challenging example. I mean, what would we do in this similar situation? Would we stand up and show the courage that those men did? My first introduction to Anzac Day as a POM was the 70th anniversary of Gallipoli, when I was fortunate enough to be there on the beaches of Gallipoli, covering it as a producer for Channel 7 as it happened. And I met those, those Anzacs who'd actually fought there, had returned. And it made me think of that today because, of course, those men have long since passed away. And I stood there in Sydney today for a couple of hours, watched the procession, and there are only a handful of guys you'd even identify as being from the Second World War. So I think the character is changing. Naturally, Peter, I think the character of the day is changing. But here's my really encouraging finding from my on-the-ground reporting this morning, is there is such a young crowd and a mixed crowd. The Homebush Boys band, for instance, I think I only saw one white face in the band. A lot of Indian kids. It's a brilliant school, I gather. Chinese kids, all in the band. And I think, I spoke to a couple of people, a woman from Philippines who was there standing next to me. She felt just as I did as a migrant to this country, that it's part of Australia. It's part of what makes Australia a great country. And I think the tradition is no doubt in my mind it's going to continue. It will change naturally, though.
All right, I want to pick up some comments from Kim Beazley, of course, a former opposition leader, now chairman of the Australian War Memorial, talking about the so-called frontier wars for the redevelopment of the memorial. Have a listen.
My preference, my concern is that the Aboriginal community of Australia gets the dignity of resistance. Now, that's something Native Americans have always had. And they have an entitlement too, I think, to that dignity of resistance.
Now, I think the War Memorial is the soul of our country, John. I have no issue with a frontier war treatment being in this new Aboriginal museum, which will be down close by the old Parliament House building. But I'm very uncomfortable with it turning up in the Australian War Memorial. What's your view?
I have reservations as well. These are stories we should tell, but they should also be told in the context of the courage of people who knew this was absolutely counter to the Western liberal idea of the value, equal value of every human being. And you think the Mile Creek Massacre, it was horrendous. The first jury acquitted the white stockmen who were responsible for the murder, saying they would not allow a white man to hang for murdering a black. It was whites who insisted that was counter to everything we should believe in and forced a retrial, and people were hung for what they had done. 9, I think, or was it 11? You've got to tell the complete story or you lose the lessons to be learnt, and the lessons are that the price of real liberty lies in the genuine equality at law and in every other way of every citizen. No one above it, no one below it.
Nick, Kate, I want to pick up this extraordinary story in The Age today that says the controversial Senator Lydia Thorpe, a whole lot of her family are all angling for control of the new Victorian voice to the Parliament. Mother, cousins, political allies, all of them. Now, this is the Victorian version to the voice. 50 of the candidates, out of 50 of the candidates, at least a dozen are aligned with Lydia Thorpe. What do you think?
This is a very informative story from The Age. It should be, compulsory reading for everybody who's thinking of voting yes, because the idea that this voice to Parliament is going to be, apolitical, that there will be naturally people who will represent all Indigenous people, even though they're not elected. It's just thrown out of the window when you read this article. It's, the voice to Parliament in Victoria is a hotbed of factionalism. And there's this huge faction called the Thorpe faction with half of the Thorpe family in, as far as I can see, that's trying to wrest control of this voice from others. This is exactly what we fear the voice in Canberra will become, and indeed it will inevitably become it. And it's worse than that because these people won't even be elected. They'll be chosen somehow. I'm still not quite sure how, and they will fight out factional battles to get control of it. It's just the way it will go, I'm afraid.
And every good Aboriginal people, just like always happened in Minority News in Parliament, will come and say, you've got the wrong people representing us. And that will be the majority of people. We've got to understand
what this thing is. They'll be the people that do the... They'll be the people that do the treaty, of course, and the reparations and all those other, I think, life-changing decisions for our country, John.
Well, that's the worry. And people who need to recognise, the Uluru Statement itself, I've got to say, it's more fist than kiss. People ought to read it. And the Prime Minister's committed to it in full. So if you're going to vote yes to the voice, recognise that demand transparency, because it plainly means we then move on to a treaty. Treaty with who? The Aboriginal people are a race, not a nation. There are 500 nations. Treaty with which nation? What do the nations that don't get a seat at the table do? Or are we going to do 500 treaties? These are serious questions. And then we get truth-telling. And I'm really worried the truth-telling will be one-sided. It won't be the whole truth. People need to demand transparency on this. Don't vote for a blank cheque.
Well, we're going to keep fighting against it, John. We're going to keep fighting against it. I have to leave it there. I'm out of time.